Hello, brains. I think it's time we cleared up some misconceptions about executive functioning and what executive functioning differences exist between ADHD brains, autistic brains, and neurotypical brains. Let's do this. Hi, I am Jag, just taking a quick break to explain some things. As late diagnosed autistic and ADHD still figuring things out one day at a time, I use AI to help me create videos so I can share my message more clearly. It helps me concentrate better, stay organized, but also tap into my creativity. This channel is a safe space for anyone who found out later in life and thought, now what? Here, I will share tips, tools, and stories I wish someone had told me when I first started this journey. If you are feeling overwhelmed, curious, or just want to feel a little less alone, you are in the right place. First off, let's talk about what executive functioning is so that we're all on the same page. Executive functioning refers to the mental skills that help us plan, focus our attention, remember instructions, manage our time, and change our behavior when necessary. These are things that most people can do without even thinking about it, because these are things that our prefrontal cortex does automatically. But when our prefrontal cortex isn't working properly, like when someone has ADHD, AuDHD, or autism, then these things become very difficult. Now let's look at this article from Psychology Today written by a psychologist who has both ADHD and autism. In this article, they discuss how their ADHD and autistic brains differ when it comes to executive functioning. When it comes to planning, the author mentions that they have to use different strategies depending on whether they're planning something as an ADHD brain or as an autistic brain. They go on to explain that both ADHD brains and autistic brains struggle with planning, but that the reasons behind the struggles are different. For example, an ADHD brain might struggle with planning because they got distracted and now they're trying to plan while also trying not to get distracted. Whereas an autistic brain might struggle with planning because they're trying to plan for every possible outcome. To illustrate this point further, the author uses the example of having to pack for a trip. The ADHD brain might forget to pack some crucial items because they were distracted by something else while making the packing list. Meanwhile, the autistic brain might make such a comprehensive packing list that it's overwhelming and takes so long to make the list that everything else gets pushed aside. The author goes on to talk about how both ADHD brains and autistic brains struggle with emotional regulation, but for different reasons. The autistic brain might struggle with emotional regulation because they didn't get their sensory needs met. Meanwhile, the ADHD brain might struggle with emotional regulation because they're overwhelmed with too many choices. In this section of the article, the author talks about how there are certain things that they need to remind themselves of when they're acting as an ADHD brain versus an autistic brain. For example, they need to remind themselves to stay on task when they're acting as an ADHD brain and to make sure that their sensory needs are met when they're acting as an autistic brain. As I read through this article, I kept thinking that this was a really good explanation of the differences between how ADHD brains and autistic brains work. However, I had a problem with the title of the article. The author titled the article How ADHD Brains and Autistic Brains Are Different, which I think is misleading. The reason why I think it's misleading is because the article doesn't just explain the difference between how ADHD brains work and how autistic brains work. It also explains how both ADHD brains and autistic brains differ from neurotypical brains. So really, the article should have been titled How ADHD Brains, Autistic Brains, and Neurotypical Brains Are Different. But that's just my opinion. But let's be real here. If the author had titled the article that way, then it wouldn't have gotten nearly as much attention as it did. This is a prime example of how neurodiversity gets erased in favor of advocacy. And I think that's really unfortunate because in doing so it gives people the impression that ADHD and autism are more alike than they are different when it comes to executive functioning. Based on the information presented in this article, I would say that both ADHD brains and autistic brains struggle more with executive functioning than neurotypical brains do. There are some executive function skills that ADHD brains tend to struggle with more than other brains, and there are other executive function skills that autistic brains struggle with more than other brains. But overall, I think it's safe to say that both ADHD brains and autistic brains struggle more with executive functioning than neurotypical brains do. I hope this video is helpful to those of you out there who have executive functioning challenges due to ADHD, due to autism, or due to both. I know how frustrating it can be to have people tell us that our struggles are all in our heads or that we're just lazy or unmotivated. Hopefully this video helps you feel less alone and helps you advocate for yourself and your neurodivergent brain. Please don't feed the trolls. All they want is attention. Not the right kind. So go on ignoring them. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye.